Hi, everyone. I am so excited because I am speaking with debut author Gina Wilkinson. And look at this beautiful, I love this book cover, Gina, so much. When the Apricots Bloom. It's absolute, look at that. I always like to look at this because that's what you see in your bookshelf. This book is just so good. I finished it yesterday. Just to give you a little backstory, my son was stationed in Iraq. He was in the army right at the end of he was one of the last troops out. Everything that he told me, and then reading this book, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And people, we are talking about Iraq. So I am going to let you tell us. I know a little bit about your backstory, but I'm going to let you tell everyone how you came up with the idea for this book.
Oh, thanks, Michelle, for having me. Wonderful to be here with you. Well, if we go back to the dawn of time, it was actually 2002. I'm a former journalist, so I was working in Bangkok in Thailand, and my husband is Canadian, and he had followed me from Canada to Australia. You might be able to tell from my accent, I'm Australian. And then he followed me from Australia to Thailand. While we were living in Thailand, he was offered a job to go and work with UNICEF in Baghdad. At that time, it was about a year or so before the start of the Iraq War. The country was still ruled by the dictator Saddam Hussein. And we were actually told that it was going to be a very quiet posting. Nothing happened there. It was completely isolated from the outside world by international sanctions. You couldn't fly in and out. There was no foreign newspapers or television. There was no internet available at home, no mobile phones. And we agreed to go. There was several snafus or challenges, I guess. The biggest being, for me personally, that Saddam Hussein didn't allow foreign journalists into Baghdad. That was a big issue. But, when we went in, I went in as with the terrible title of dependent spouse. I said, I'll just put my career on the back burner. You've been following me around for a while. Very soon after we arrived, I was befriended by a local woman who I later discovered was actually an informant and was working for the regime's secret police, reporting back on where I went, who I met, what I did. I should say straight up that I don't blame her for that. In Saddam Hussein's Iraq, if the secret police wanted something from you, you really weren't in a position to say no, especially someone like her who came from a fairly humble background, who had children to protect. But, throughout the years, I've always wondered, was it just an act? Was it just an unpleasant duty for her? Or were we really friends? And this kept going through my mind. And many years later, I was living in Washington, D.C. I decided that I would start writing a book, thinking about the moment, starting with the very moment that the secret police arrive at the home of an Iraqi secretary who works for a foreign embassy and demand that she befriend her boss's wife and spy on her in order to gain confidential information. And so when the Apricots Bloom is inspired by that real life relationship. The rest of the plot is fiction. That particular starting point, it comes from my own experience.
I thought you did such an amazing job making me feel like I was there. Your description of the country and the lifestyle. When I was reading this book, I felt like I would talk to the kids afterwards and I'm like talking about it and they're like, what country are you in again? I'm like, Iraq. I'm like, it's beautiful. And I don't know, you did such a great job with that. I just have to say, I really taking me to that place. This book is about three women, through three very strong women. So tell us about their relationship.
Yeah, often when you hear stories of, from countries that are in conflict, it's often told by men. And of course, there are many women living in these situations, and usually we don't get to hear as much from them, especially not in the present tense, maybe very, very historical fiction, but usually these sort of stories are told by men. Of course, I had a very different experience in Baghdad. When I went there, I put my career on the back burner and I became a dependent spouse. And that is, a very similar situation to what one of the second narrators of the novel, her name is Ali. She's the diplomat's wife that's being spied on. So Huda is the character who is the secretary, who has to be an informant, and she spies on Ali. And so Ali has some similarities to me. She's a former journalist who gives up her job, goes in with this terrible title of dependent spouse. But I guess the big differences between us are that while I did feel some of the loneliness that Ali and that isolation that she feels when she first arrived, I went out and got myself a part-time job working with the United Nations Oil for Food program. But the biggest difference is that, before I went into Iraq, I had been told, assume your phone is bugged, your home phone. Definitely the office is bugged. Assume your house is bugged. If you want to have a private conversation with your husband, go for a walk outside where there's no power source, so there can't be any hidden microphones. I knew I was being watched. So I didn't know it was by one of my closest friends, but I was very aware of the fact that I could be under surveillance. So I was very careful to leave my journalism craft to the side, not to go around investigating sensitive matters, especially because I was attached to the United Nations. So I had some of the protections that ordinary local people didn't. And, anyone around me, if I'd done anything like that, would have been in huge peril. But Ali has, a secret that she's investigating. So I guess that's one of the big differences in that character, because people often ask if she's autobiographical.
Yeah.
So I'd say parts are and parts aren't. And the third character is the character of Rania, and she's an artist. And I really wanted to show another side of Iraq, one that I really loved, and that's the amazing art scene in Baghdad. Mm-hmm. A lot of my Iraqi friends were very nervous about being seen with me in public because that would attract the attention of the secret police. But luckily, there were about 24 independent art galleries operating in Baghdad when I was there. And I would often go there in my free time. And in that environment, that was one of the few places that I could meet with people and talk with people and not necessarily draw the attention of the secret police to them. And I think that's because, centuries, actually millennium, Iraq has been a leader of artistic culture in the world. I mean, we know a lot about their other inventions, the wheel, the invention of, the first writing system, the first legal system, the plow, but also they had a great artistic culture. And artists always played that role of connectors between the outside world and the inside world. And that continued to some degree. And so that gave us a little bit more freedom to associate. And I wanted to show that side of culture in Baghdad that's quite different from what you would have seen, on your TV screens during the Iraq War, the more beautiful side of Baghdad. And the third character of Rania, who is a childhood friend of Huda's, and they become estranged, and through Ali, they are brought together again. So that's really why I invented that third character, to bring out a different side of Baghdad and a more, complete view of the country as I experienced it.
When I'm reading it, I'm always like having conversations with the author. I kind of do that as I'm reading it, like as if I could ask you the question right there. And the one question I kept having was that, like you said, when you wanted to have a private conversation, you knew to go for a walk. You would say in the book, Huda would say to her husband, like, let's go out to the gardens or let's go. And I used to think, well, don't they know? Don't they know that that's what you're doing? Like, do they have the, don't they understand that you're only having conversations outside? That was my question.
Yeah, well, who knows? I guess going for a walk is a thing everybody does. And I go out into the garden with my husband every opportunity I have, when he would come home from work, for example, when we were living in Washington, D.C., I'd be like, okay, let's have, that was our relaxing time in the evening. We'd walk around the garden. So I guess that's a fairly normal thing. But, I know some of my Iraqi friends had code words that they used when they wanted to talk about something sensitive. One of my friends, if they ever wanted to talk about Saddam Hussein in some way, their code word was brown cow, and they went to quite a lot of, effort to protect themselves. I mean, in general, people didn't talk about politics. I show in the book how Saddam Hussein was everywhere. Ali lives in a house and where she looks out her window and is confronted by an enormous billboard of Saddam Hussein on the telephone. And that's actually modeled on my own house. I looked at an enormous billboard of Saddam Hussein every day. And she feels like he's looking at her and she's looking at him. And there was a saying at that time that there were 5 million statues and billboards and murals of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, one to watch over every person in the city. And that's what it felt like. But at the same time, it was completely taboo to say his name out loud. If you said his name out loud, locals would get very nervous because they would worry if there's an informant nearby, their ears will prick up and they're going to come over and pay attention to what you're saying. Or if there's a hidden microphone, you're going to trigger trigger it. Whoever's listening to the tape is going to sit up when they hear Saddam Hussein's name. So it's that strange dichotomy of knowing you're being watched, knowing what the real situation is, but really being unable to talk about it. And I've got to say, again, in the artistic community, that was one of the few places where I felt sometimes, on the canvas, I could read messages that perhaps people couldn't say out loud, because it's all up to your own interpretation, of course. That's what I would see. Maybe the artist had a different intention, but that's something that you could look at and think, no, what is the artist saying here? Is this a cry for freedom, or a expression of how they feel under Saddam Hussein, or is it just two people sitting on a bench? So that sort of opened those doors a bit more.
Yeah, and Huda was like stressed. I mean, the woman, I felt so bad for her, because not only was she trying to have a relationship with her husband, which was stressful, and then her son, which was stressful, and then having these people around her and having to befriend Ali, and like she had a lot to keep up on. Like I felt really, by the end of the book, I loved her so much, and I was just like, wow. When you think about what a woman can do, like to me, like she showed how strong you can be if you have to be, and that's what I loved about her. And she kind of was like, these men around her, okay, are all just kind of like not, like her husband was causing her more problems, and she was just like, oh my God, like would you just listen? Because his ego, because of women and her stature and what she was doing, was threatening to him. So she was trying to balance. I don't know, I could go on and on about her. I loved that character so much, and I loved Ali, and I loved her naiveness to the situation. She didn't understand, and Huda had to keep telling her like not telling her, but telling her what she needed to do, and she kept not doing it. And so it was refreshing to see it from her. Like, I don't understand. I took a ride from somebody. She was like, "What? You took a ride? You can't do that." So it was, oh, what a great book, Gina. Seriously.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed writing the character of Huda in particular. There are three strong women in it, but like you, she's also my favorite. And I guess that's also because through her, I get to explore the issue of, what do people do when they're under extreme circumstance? I was a war correspondent for many years, lived in extreme circumstances. And, from my own experience, I know that, people can behave in very unexpected ways. A very meek person can suddenly become very brave. A person who's highly ethical can suddenly make a mistake that's completely out of character. And I wanted to look at this issue of how does someone behave when they're under extreme pressure, and especially when what they're asked to do goes against their own morals and their own ethical beliefs. How do they respond? Do they give in straight away? Do they dig their heels in? Do they try and negotiate the situation? And, where do they draw the line? That was an area that I could really get into with Huda, and I really enjoyed that aspect. And speaking of women, I also really enjoyed putting it in a domestic context. There's these huge high stakes. They're dealing with a ruthless secret police, life and death issues, and yet they're still cooking dinner. They're still doing the laundry. And, I think, women all over the world are going to see aspects of their own lives reflected in these characters. Huda is frequently going on diets and falling off the diet bandwagon. That is a very common experience for many women. Huda and Rania are both dealing with,
right?
Yes, she loves her sweets. That's right. Yeah. Huda and Rania both have rebellious teenagers. Many people can relate to that. Huda in particular is trying to juggle work life and home life. So these are challenges that I think women all over the world are facing. And I wanted to try and show that, while we have differences, we might bake our bread differently, we might pray differently, the critical things we really do share in common. And at the moment, society feels so divided. And, I hope that literature, by allowing people to step into someone else's shoes, especially someone that you might never, ever get the chance to meet, you can see things from their perspective and understand that, perhaps you would make those same decisions. Perhaps you would make those same mistakes. Books right now, I feel, especially in this era of social media, they're perhaps even more important in terms of bringing us together and showing us what we share at a time when we really do feel divided.
So before I let you go, what are you working on right now?
Yes, I've got two different ideas in mind. Oh, well, the immediate things I'm working on, homeschooling my children, renovating a house. Oh my gosh. My next story is actually going to be about a woman driven slowly insane and bankrupt while renovating her old house. It's a horror story. No, that's my real life. Oh, hang on. I've got a couple ideas. Both of them are set, I'm thinking about the 1980s. That was when I was a teenager. And also, I like to have a bit of suspense in my stories.
Do.
And the mobile phone is a real suspense killer. It's hard to be very suspenseful when you can just dial 911 pull something out of your back pocket. You can get a GPS. You can Google, how do I solve XYZ solution? You can check someoe's background instantly. Whereas the 1980s, I was a teenager then. That's pre-mobile technology, and also an interesting era. So I'm thinking about going back in time, and that was also one thing about writing that book in Iraq. At that time, you couldn't use mobile phones. There was mobile phone technology starting to be used, but not in Baghdad. It was forbidden. And even, in my case, my house phone only worked intermittently. I had to go into the office if I wanted to use internet, and if I wanted to send a confidential email. There was only one computer at the UN office that I could use. So, that it sort of took you back to that time before mobile phones, and made characters, rely on their own wits rather than just Googling the answer. So, I'm looking at something set in the 80s. I'm just trying to work out whether I'm going to set it in small town Australia. I grew up in a variety of very small towns with, no traffic lights, that sort of situation, or perhaps somewhere outside of Maryland, where I was living in the US for 6 years until recently, on the edge of Maryland and West Virginia, that area. You're looking at perhaps something more present day and something in the Civil War era, because I went to visit a lot of the Civil War sites, and it's a very interesting part of town. I did a lot of hiking there with part of the US. Sorry, I did a lot of hiking there with my kids, and sometimes you would come across small relics of the Civil War, just embedded in the ground, and that really made me think too about a past and present story that moves between two different timelines. So once I'm finished the horror story of renovating my house, I'm going to dive into it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And everyone, again, look at this book. You can get it right now at Amazon. I am so happy I read it. When I got done, I was like, wow, I am so happy that I got introduced to this book, and it will stick with me for a long time, this story. So I just want to thank you for that. And I look forward to your next one. Make sure I get a copy so we can talk again.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. Yes, you will be top of the list. Thank you very much.
Okay, awesome. Well,
wonderful to talk to you.
Yes, thank you. And you're going into winter. We're coming into spring. So we're on opposite ends.
Enjoy.
I'm so happy that our connection was good. So anyway, thank you so much, and we will talk soon.